Lotus, mirra и ладан.
Lotus, myrrh, and frankincense. Rich spices and essential oils. These fragrances accompanied the ancient Egyptians throughout their lives and didn't leave them after their death. What was the reason they loved them so much? And what was their purpose?
Вступая в зыбкие пространства науки о запахах, которые характеризуют ту или иную цивилизацию,
Entering an elusive world of the science of sense which represent one or another civilization, we unwillingly become hostages of the myths, historical events, and mysteries that are completely impermeable to modern science.
и получается так, что эпоха, о которой мы будем говорить,
It so happens that the era we are going to be talking about, ancient Egypt, will appear before us not only in its artifacts, well known through museum collections and reconstructions, but also as an era that is fragrant.
Парфюмерия как
Perfumery as a phenomenon started long before the beginning of the ancient Egyptian civilization. But it is in Egypt where the basics of all modern perfumery were created. Incenses are frequently mentioned in Egyptian literature. The images of essential oil containers can be found in reliefs and paintings of ancient tombs. It shows how important perfumery was in the daily life of ancient Egyptians.
В Древнем Египте
In ancient Egypt, perfumery had both secular and religious purposes. Secular and ritual fragrances had their differences, but they were made with the same ingredients. At that time, the range of materials used for perfumery was quite narrow.
египетская цивилизация была немножко ограничена в тех компонентах, которые она использовала.
Egyptian civilization was a bit limited in the components used for fragrances and incenses,
Так называемых
or so-called ointments and unguents.
впоследствии. Почему ограничена?
Why limited?
Что та флора,
Well, because Egyptian flora and the materials that found their ways to Egyptian priests were limited by the distance and possibilities of delivery. This was the main reason. The French use the phrase l'air du temps, air of the times. They say that each civilization has its own unique fragrance. So ancient Egyptian civilization smelled of balsamic aromas.
запахи Древнего Египта – это запахи хвойных растений.
The scents of ancient Egypt were the scents of coniferous plants, myrrh, frankincense, cedar, and juniper. The aromas of lotus flowers and lilies, and spikenard, the spicy smells of cinnamon, nutmeg, and black pepper.
ну, это тяжеловатые немножко запахи, но вместе с тем
These fragrances are a little heavy, but at the same time, in the bright sun, under a dazzling blue sky, the half-naked people who used it, ancient Egyptians' fashion implies being half-naked. All of it wasn't so heavy or so tryingly sweet as it would have been for a modern person wearing a suit, in a, so to speak, modern fashion. It's absolutely different.
для человека современного, одетого в современный костюм. среди современной, скажем, природы Европы. Это совершенно другое.
Ароматические вещества, которые использовали
The aromatic substances used by the ancient Egyptians were mainly essential oils and resins. They also used herbs and spices, some of which were brought to Egypt by caravans and ships coming from abroad. Covering huge distances, the caravans moved slowly, so the aromatic substances had to have very strong and lasting fragrances. The ancient Egyptians manufactured essential oils using the same methods that are used today: steam distillation and maceration. After that, the essential oils could be used by themselves or be diluted into basic oils such as sesame, peach, olive, or almond oil.
Другим способом извлечения запаха
Another way to extract an aroma was through heating. Egyptians burned aromatic substances, and the smoke was very fragrant.
Слово парфюмерия произошло от латинского перфумум сквозь дым. И вот тут мы подходим.
The word perfume comes from the Latin perfumum, through the smoke.
В истории Египта, древнего Египта,
So here we are approaching a very unique practice in Egyptian history,
многих тысяч лет и
a practice that would be carried on for centuries after that: incensing.
помещения, одежды,
Incensing rooms, clothes, curtains, and so on. It had very different purposes. One of them was, I'd say, ritual, and another merely practical.
одним из ароматических
One of the aromatic substances used for burning were resins.
там такие драгоценные смолы, которые обязательно использовались, как мира и ладан. Они были
There were such resins as myrrh and frankincense, and they were not as heavy and unctuous as we may think. They were light, exquisite, and tart.
легкими, изысканными, терпкими.
мирры и ладана
There was enough myrrh and frankincense in Egypt, so there was no need to bring it in from abroad.
У них было огромное количество этого ладана, огромное.
They had enormous amounts of this frankincense, enormous amounts of myrrh. There are 3 types of frankincense: white, gray, and black.
Это божественное.
Of course, the black one was the most precious. It had a celestial smell, the smell of heaven, extremely sophisticated and very, very exquisite.
с ладаном связаны
One thing, though, is quite puzzling.
в настоящий момент.
Today, the species of boswellia trees that were used to make frankincense are included on the red list of endangered species. Their number is rapidly decreasing. The amount of frankincense that could be extracted from these trees with steam distillation would be extremely small. And yet, according to historical sources at the times of Alexander the Great, the amount of frankincense reached dozens of tons, and Egyptian priests always had enough of it. Concerning myrrh, there were 2 types used: the bitter kind and the sweet one. The bitter kind of myrrh is used for perfumery now, and this is how they used it in ancient Egypt too. It's a mystery whether they use sweet myrrh or not. We can't really tell. But this is the kind that is used in Christianity for the famous ritual of confirmation.
Изготовление вот этого знаменитого мира, да, для миропомазания.
These are the 2 precious resins which they definitely used in Egypt.
Которые они использовали.
They also used essential oils of cypress, of fir, and many other conifers.
Именно такие хвойные запахи и называют бальзамическими.
These kinds of conifer fragrances are called balsamic, but the ritual purposes of such substances as resins and oils were not limited to embalming alone. They were used as offerings to gods and the dead. During so-called feasts of the dead, when the living would eat a ritual meal in a tomb, they used perfumed wax cones and put fragrant lotus flowers and liquid perfumes on the tables. They burned incenses in ritual rooms. The bottles of perfume were placed in sarcophagi. Sometimes these bottles were depicted in reliefs or painted on the tomb walls. One of the most famous burial rituals that called for using essential oils was the opening of the mouth ceremony. Ancient Egyptians believed that to survive in the afterlife, a human soul needed food and drink. The opening of the mouth ceremony was a part of the burial ritual and was performed in order to give the soul the ability to eat and drink in the underworld. The ritual was a symbolic opening of the eyes and mouth of a statue that represented the mummy of the deceased. During that process, the room was incensed, and the eyes and the mouth of the statue were moistened by so-called 7 sacred oils. 7 sacred oils, or 7 sacred unguents, are 7 oil mixtures that were listed on tomb walls, altars, and perfume containers. The 7 unguents' history dates back to the times of the 5th dynasty. Each of them consisted of several ingredients, such as fir and frankincense resins, lotus and acacia flowers. These unguents served different purposes in the burial ritual. Their images were used to paint the tomb walls on both sides of the painted doors and on the offering table, although the latter tradition was practiced only in the Old Kingdom. The main purpose of the 7 sacred unguents was to lather the body during its preparation for the afterlife. The process of preparing the mummy was perhaps the most mysterious ritual in the whole burial cult of ancient Egypt throughout its history. The usage of aromatic substances was absolutely necessary for the process and was available for all social classes in Egypt, and there were several reasons for that. The first one is related to the ancient Egyptians' beliefs. They considered pleasant fragrances to be sacred, and using them during the mummification process would ensure their deceased's rebirth and a successful afterlife. And of course, such an important ritual, as well as the objects used for it, had its own patron gods. Anubis was believed to be connected to the mummification process. They called him the defender of the dead. In the myth of Osiris, it was Anubis who helped Isis embalm the king of the underworld's body. Anubis's daughter, the goddess Kibichet, was thought to be a deification of embalming liquid. It was believed that Kibichet, whose name can be translated as cooling water, was offering water to the souls waiting for the mummification process to finish. The second reason for using incenses for the body preparation was purely practical. To understand it better, let's take a closer look at the mummification process. The practice of mummification dates back to the 3rd dynasty, around 2600 BC. However, it had only been perfected by the year 1000 BC, by the time of the 21st dynasty. It took the Egyptians many centuries of trial and error to master the technique of preserving the bodies of their dead and making them look more alive. As a result, the mummification method evolved into a certain set of steps that had to be taken to protect the body from decaying. Before the body could be buried, the internal organs had to be removed. After the brain extraction, a new kingdom invention, the cranial cavity was filled with a molten resin mixture. After the organ removal, the body was washed with spices and palm wine. The wine helped the Egyptians not only to clean the body, but to hide the smell of decay. After that, the body was covered in natron. With this, the ancient Egyptians attempted to copy the effects of natural mummification, which occurred when bodies were buried in shallow graves in hot weather. The body had to stay in the natron bath for 40 days. After that, its skin became tough and wrinkled. To make it smooth and soft again, and to give it a pleasant smell, the priest would cover it in ox fat, special ointments, and cedar oil. Body cavities were filled with spices like cinnamon. Filling the cavities helped make the body look more alive. The usage of cinnamon can be explained with its strong and pleasant fragrance. The wrappings were soaked in myrrh, cassia, and camphor oil. Using resins to soak the wrappings dates back to the Egyptians' first attempts in mummification. The idea was that the hardened resin-soaked wrappings would help keep the initial shape of the body, as well as preserve it better. Oils, resins, and spices used for the embalming were chosen not only because of their fragrances, but because of their antibacterial properties as well. Thus, during the beginning stages of mummification, myrrh was used to seal the body and stop the process of flesh decay, as well as to hide the smell of decomposition. Later on, when mummification techniques reached their peak in preserving the body, essential oils were continued to be used for their cosmetic purposes. The ingredients of many essential oil mixtures and embalming liquids of ancient Egypt remain a mystery up to this day, for it was in ancient Egypt where the tradition of keeping perfume recipes a secret was born.
Именно в Древнем Египте было заложено такое правило никогда не раскрывать.
It was Egypt where the rule was first founded, the rule to never uncover the secrets of your recipes. All the priests who were creating essential mixtures kept it a secret from everyone else and never told anyone anything about it. So those pieces of information available to us nowadays about perfume mixtures, or as they're also called, incenses, in Old Russian this was the word used for aromas. Only 100 years ago, a perfume factory would be called an incense factory. Anyway, all that was definitely shrouded in mystery back in those days.
Было покрыто мраком. Обязательно. Это было правило игры.
Heavy and tart, the smells of embalming liquids filled the tombs. In one such tomb, an ancient burial shroud spent many long centuries. Alas, fragrances don't last this long, although it seems at times that we can still feel it, or is this only our imagination?